My daughter's birthday gift contained a key to a place. I never told her about the key sat in my palm like a small accusation. Silver, unremarkable, with a rubber tag bearing 4 digits I recognized instantly. My daughter had wrapped it in tissue paper, placed it in a white envelope, and handed it to me across the table at the restaurant where we'd met for my birthday lunch. She'd smiled when I opened it, the kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes, and said nothing while I stared at the numbers. I set the key on the tablecloth between us. The waiter refilled our water glasses and disappeared. My daughter folded her hands and waited. "Where did you get this?" I asked. "Does it matter?" It mattered more than anything I could think of in that moment, but I kept my voice level. "It does to me." She picked up her fork, moved a piece of lettuce around her plate, set the fork down again. "I found some papers, old ones, in Mom's things." That narrowed it down, but not enough. I wrapped my fingers around the key and felt the ridges press into my skin. I've always believed that a man's value shows in what he chooses to keep private. Not secrets born of shame, but the protected spaces where a person stores the parts of himself that won't survive scrutiny or explanation. I had such a space. I'd maintained it for 32 years, paid the fees on time every quarter, visited it perhaps twice a year when I needed to remember why certain decisions had been necessary. I'd told no one. Not my wife when she was alive, not my daughter, not the handful of friends who thought they knew me well. The storage facility sat on the eastern edge of town, one of those low brick buildings with rolling doors and keypads, built back when the area was still industrial. The neighborhood had gentrified around it, coffee shops and boutiques replacing machine shops and warehouses, but the storage place remained, grandfathered in, utilitarian and anonymous. I drove there that evening. The key felt heavy in my jacket pocket, though it weighed almost nothing. My daughter had claimed a headache after lunch and left before dessert arrived. I'd sat alone with my untouched cake and tried to reconstruct how this could have happened. My wife had died 16 months earlier, a stroke that took her in her sleep, merciful in its swiftness if not its timing. We'd been planning a trip, something we'd delayed for years while life offered its usual distractions. In the aftermath, my daughter had taken charge of sorting through her mother's belongings, a task I'd been grateful to delegate. I'd assumed she would find the usual things: photographs, jewelry, letters from relatives. I'd not imagined she would find any trace of Unit 407. The facility's parking lot held 3 cars. I pulled into a space near the back and sat with the engine running. The sun had dropped below the buildings to the west, leaving the sky a pale gray that would deepen to black within the hour. I turned, off the ignition, and listened to the engine tick as it cooled. The lobby was empty except for a young man behind a glass partition, absorbed in his phone. He glanced up when I entered, nodded once, and returned his attention to the screen. I walked past him to the corridor marked C through F and followed the numbers until I reached 447. The lock turned smoothly. I lifted the door and stepped inside, pulling the chain to turn on the overhead bulb. The light was harsh and immediate, throwing shadows against cardboard boxes stacked along the right wall. A metal filing cabinet stood in the corner. A pair of chairs, the folding kind, leaned against the left side, everything exactly as I'd left it 4 months prior. I closed the door behind me and stood in the center of the 10 by 10 space. The air smelled of concrete and old paper. I pulled one of the chairs open and sat facing the filing cabinet. The top drawer held financial records, statements from an account I'd closed in 1996, receipts for transactions that no longer appeared on any active ledger. I'd kept them as proof of something, though I couldn't say exactly what. Insurance, perhaps, against a future accusation, evidence that I'd acted within the rules, even when the rules had been bent to near breaking. The second drawer contained correspondence, letters from people whose names I still remembered, but whose faces had faded. Some of the letters were business, proposals, and counter-proposals from a time when deals were still made with handshakes and confirmed with signatures. Others were personal, though that term felt inadequate. They were the kind of letters people write when they believe no one else will read them, confessions and justifications and quiet pleading. The bottom drawer was locked with a separate key, one I kept on my own ring. I didn't open it that first visit. I sat in the folding chair and tried to work backward from the present to the point where my daughter could have learned about this place. My wife had been meticulous with files, but she'd had no reason to keep anything related to the storage unit. I'd paid the fees from an account she never accessed, one I'd maintained separately for reasons I'd explained as professional necessity. She'd accepted that explanation because it was partly true, and because our marriage had been built on a foundation of mutual discretion. We didn't pry. We didn't inventory each other's private spaces. But my daughter was a different kind of person. She'd inherited her mother's organizational mind, but coupled it with a curiosity that bordered on suspicion. Even as a child, she'd asked questions that had no good answers, the kind of questions that expose the gap between what people say and what they do. I'd learned early to be careful around her, to keep my stories straight and my records clean. I left the unit after 20 minutes and drove home. My house felt larger than it should, rooms that had once held the noise of daily life, now silent except for the hum of appliances and the creak of settling wood. I made coffee and sat at the kitchen table with my laptop, pulling up the online portal for the storage facility. The account showed regular payments stretching back to the original contract date. No missed months, no lapses. The login credentials were stored in a password manager my wife had never known about. I scrolled through the payment history and found nothing that would explain how my daughter had connected me to Unit 447. Then I checked the email account I'd used when setting up the storage rental. It was an address I accessed perhaps twice a year, usually to confirm that the automatic payments were processing. The inbox held the expected clutter of promotional messages and system notifications. I scrolled back through the months and found it. An email from 7 weeks earlier, sent to my wife's old address. The subject line read, "Inquiry regarding storage unit access." The message came from a law firm I didn't recognize. It stated that they were attempting to settle an estate matter and needed to confirm the location of certain property. It listed the storage facility's name and asked if the recipient had any knowledge of a unit registered under my name. My wife's email account should have been closed after her death. I'd contacted the provider myself and followed their process for account termination. But this message had been sent after that termination, which meant someone had either reactivated the account or found a way to access archived messages. I forwarded the email to myself and then called the law firm. The office was closed, but the voicemail offered an after-hours number for urgent matters. I called that number and reached an answering service. I left my name and contact information and said I was returning an inquiry about estate matters. The callback came at 9 the next morning. A woman's voice, professional and neutral. She identified herself as a paralegal and confirmed that their office had sent the inquiry. "Can you tell me who requested this information?" I asked. "I'm not at liberty to share client details, but I can confirm that the inquiry was related to a probate matter. My wife's estate was settled months ago. Everything was straightforward." "I understand. This inquiry was related to a separate matter." I kept my tone even. "What matter?" "I'm sorry, sir. I can only discuss this with authorized parties. I'm the person named in your email. I'm authorizing myself." She paused long enough for me to hear the clicking of a keyboard. The inquiry was filed on behalf of a family member seeking to locate property referenced in documents discovered during estate settlement. That's all I can tell you. I thanked her and ended the call. Then I sat at the table and worked through the implications. My daughter had found something in her mother's belongings, something that mentioned the storage unit. She'd hired a lawyer to make inquiries, probably wanting to establish the facts before confronting me directly. The lawyer had sent an email to my wife's old address, not realizing or not caring that the account was defunct. But somehow my daughter had seen that email or had been told about it, unless my daughter had reactivated the account herself. I opened my laptop again and pulled up the email provider's support page. It took 3 attempts and a phone call to reach someone who could answer my question. Yes, an account could be reactivated by someone with access to recovery information. Yes, a family member could do this if they had the deceased person's identification and legal authority. My daughter had both. I spent the rest of that day reviewing every document I could find from my wife's papers. I'd boxed most of them after her death, labeled the boxes, and stored them in the garage. I carried them one by one into the house and went through them with the kind of attention I usually reserved for contracts. In the third box, tucked inside a folder labeled Medical Records, I found a single sheet of paper. It was a photocopy of a receipt from the storage facility, dated 1994. The receipt showed a payment for the first 3 months of rental on Unit 447. In the corner, in my wife's handwriting, were the words, "Ask about this." She'd known, not everything, but enough to have questions she'd never asked, and she'd kept the receipt, filed it in a place where it would eventually be found. I've thought often about what separates a lie from a protected truth. A lie is active, a deliberate construction meant to deceive. A protected truth is passive, a piece of information you keep to yourself not because it's false, but because revealing it would cause more harm than good. I'd built my understanding of the storage unit on that distinction. What I kept there wasn't a lie. It was history, preserved and contained, doing no harm as long as it stayed within those walls. But my daughter didn't see it that way. The key was proof of that. She'd found evidence of something hidden and had decided that hiding itself was the betrayal. I called her that evening. She answered on the third ring. "We need to talk," I said. "I thought we did." "Not in a restaurant. At the house." She was silent for a moment. "When?" "Tomorrow morning." "Fine." She arrived at 10 carrying a leather folder I recognized as the one she used for work. She kissed my cheek in the foyer and followed me to the living room. I'd made coffee, set out cups, done the small preparatory things that give a difficult conversation the appearance of normalcy. She sat on the sofa and placed the folder on the cushion beside her. I took the chair across from her. "You've been to the unit," I said. "No, not yet." "But you have the key." "I had it made, from the number on the receipt." "And you want to know what's inside?" She leaned forward, her hands folded between her knees. "I want to know why you kept it secret." "From Mom." "From me." "Because it wasn't something that concerned either of you." "How do you know that?" "Because I'm the one who put it there." She sat back. "That's not an answer." "It's the only one I have right now." She picked up the folder and opened it on her lap. Inside were copies of documents neatly organized in clear sleeves. She pulled one out and handed it to me. It was a bank statement from 1993, showing regular deposits into an account I'd closed decades earlier. The deposits were substantial, larger than my salary at the time. My name was on the account, but so was another name, one I hadn't spoken aloud in years. "Who is Richard Kemper?" my daughter asked. I set the statement on the coffee table. "Someone I worked with a long time ago." "Worked with how?" "We were partners, briefly." "In what?" I picked up my coffee cup and found it had gone cold. "A business venture that didn't work out." "A business venture that required a storage unit you've kept for 30 years? "It required documentation, records." "Of what?" I stood and walked to the window. The street outside was quiet, lined with trees that had been planted before I moved to this house, before my daughter was born. I watched a man walk past with a dog, the two of them moving in the easy rhythm of routine. "There were agreements," I said, "contracts, things that needed to be kept safe but separate from other affairs." "That sounds like you were hiding something illegal." I turned to face her. "It sounds that way because you wanted to. What I kept wasn't illegal. It was private." "Then why not tell Mom?" "Because she didn't need to carry it." My daughter stood and crossed to where I was standing. She was tall, nearly my height, and when she looked at me, her eyes held the same steady assessment I'd relied on in negotiations and difficult conversations. "Dad," she said, "I'm not trying to destroy anything, but Mom left me that receipt for a reason. She wanted me to find it. Or she filed it carelessly and forgot about it." "She didn't forget anything. You know that." I did know that. My wife had possessed a memory that archived everything, a trait I'd admired and occasionally feared. If she'd kept the receipt, she'd meant for it to be found. "What do you want from me?" I asked. "I want to see what's in the unit with you. I want you to explain it." "And if I don't?" "Then I'll go by myself. I have the key. I have the right. You have neither. I'm your daughter. I'm Mom's daughter. If there's something in that unit that involves our family, I have every right to know." She was correct. legally and morally, though I wasn't ready to concede either point. I returned to my chair and sat down. She remained standing by the window. "Give me a week," I said. "For what?" "To go through everything, to make sure there's nothing that would complicate things." "Complicate how?" "For you, for people who are still living." She studied me for a long moment. "1 week, then we go together. Or I go alone." After she left, I drove back to the facility. It was afternoon, the parking lot fuller than it had been during my previous visit. I parked and walked to Unit 447 without pausing in the lobby. Inside, I turned on the light and opened the bottom drawer of the filing cabinet. The contents were exactly as I'd left them. A leather binder containing a partnership agreement between myself and Richard Kemper, dated 1992. A second binder with financial projections and market analyses. A manila envelope holding photographs, the kind taken at business dinners and industry events, faces I mostly remembered, and a few I didn't. Beneath those items was a smaller envelope, sealed with tape that had yellowed over the years. I'd placed it in the drawer in 1997 and hadn't opened it since. I broke the seal now and slid out the contents. 3 letters, handwritten on personal stationery, all addressed to me, all from a woman named Catherine Rowe. I sat in the folding chair and read them in the order they'd been written. The first was dated April 1993. It thanked me for my discretion and understanding. It expressed hope that we could maintain a professional relationship despite the personal circumstances. It was signed simply C. The second letter was from October 1993. The tone was colder, more formal. It referenced a conversation we'd had and asked me to honor an agreement we'd made. It reminded me that certain matters were best left unspoken. The third letter was from March 1996. 2 pages, written in a hand that shook with emotion or illness or both. It explained things I'd already known and added details I wished I didn't. It ended with a request that I keep the correspondence somewhere safe in case questions arose later. Catherine Rowe had been Richard Kemper's wife. The business venture we'd started together had collapsed not because of market conditions or poor planning, but because Richard had been arrested for embezzlement from a previous employer. The investigation had been thorough and public. His conviction had made regional news. His wife had divorced him while he was awaiting sentencing. I'd been cleared of any involvement. The authorities had examined our partnership and found nothing connecting me to Richard's crimes. But the association had been enough to damage my reputation, and I'd spent the next 2 years rebuilding my professional standing. Catherine had written to me because she'd feared I might speak publicly about what I knew, details about Richard's behavior and financial practices that could have extended his sentence or complicated her divorce. I'd agreed to remain silent, not because I owed her anything, but because dredging up the past served no purpose. The storage unit had become the place where I kept evidence of that silence. Records showing that our partnership had been legitimate, that I'd acted in good faith, that I'd been a victim of Richard's deception rather than a participant, and the letters from Catherine, proof that I'd honored my word. I returned the letters to their envelope and placed everything back in the drawer. Then I locked it and sat in the dim light, thinking about what my daughter would see if I brought her here. She would see financial records that looked suspicious without context. She would read letters that implied a relationship I'd kept hidden. She would form conclusions based on fragments of a story I'd never fully told. Or I could explain it to her now, before she saw anything. I could provide the context and let her judge whether my choices had been justified. I spent the rest of that week preparing a document. I wrote out the timeline of my partnership with Richard, the discovery of his crimes, the investigation that had cleared me. I included copies of news articles and legal filings that corroborated the facts. I wrote about Catherine's letters and why I'd kept them. When I finished, the document ran to 23 pages. I printed it, placed it in a binder, and called my daughter. "I'll meet you at the unit on Saturday," I said. "Bring the key." She arrived 5 minutes early. I was already there, standing in the open doorway of Unit 447 with the overhead light on. She parked next to my car and walked across the lot carrying her leather folder. "Morning," she said. "Morning." She stepped inside and looked around. Her gaze moved from the boxes to the filing cabinet to the chairs, taking inventory without comment. I handed her the binder. Read this first. She opened it and scanned the first page. This is a timeline of everything related to this unit, why it exists, what's in it. She pulled out one of the folding chairs and sat down. I leaned against the filing cabinet and waited while she read. It took her nearly 40 minutes. She turned pages slowly, pausing occasionally to reread a section. When she reached the end, she closed the binder and set it on her lap. Richard Kemper was prosecuted, she said. Yes, and you weren't. Correct. But you kept all of this for 30 years. I kept it in case questions came up later, in case someone tried to implicate me in something I hadn't done. She opened the binder again and flipped to the section about Catherine's letters. These are personal. They're part of the record. They show why I stayed silent. They also show you had a relationship with her. A professional one. Is that what you'd call it? I pushed away from the filing cabinet and stood directly in front of her. If you're asking whether I had an affair with Catherine Kemper, the answer is no. If you're asking whether she wrote to me personally, the answer is yes. She was going through a divorce from a man who'd ruined both their lives. She needed someone to listen. I did that. Nothing more. My daughter closed the binder again. Did Mom know about her? She knew I'd worked with Richard. She knew about the investigation. I never mentioned Catherine specifically. Why not? Because it wasn't relevant. Because bringing her up would have raised questions that had no good answers. Because your mother and I had an understanding about what we shared and what we kept to ourselves. That sounds like another way of saying you lied. I protected her from unnecessary worry. By hiding things. By exercising discretion. She stood and handed me the binder. I want to see the filing cabinet. I unlocked the bottom drawer and stepped aside. She knelt and went through the contents piece by piece. She read the partnership agreement. She examined the financial projections. She opened the envelope and read Catherine's letters. When she finished, she placed everything back exactly as it had been and stood. Okay, she said. Okay, what? I understand now. I closed the drawer and locked it. And I think you should have told Mom, not because you did anything wrong, but because keeping this secret made it bigger than it needed to be. Maybe? Not maybe, definitely. We stood facing each other in the small space. The overhead light buzzed faintly, a sound I'd never noticed before. What are you going to do with all this? She asked. I don't know yet. You should get rid of it, not because it's bad, but because holding on to it means you still think you need to defend yourself. She was right, though I wasn't ready to admit it. I'd spent 3 decades maintaining this archive as proof of my innocence, evidence I could produce if anyone questioned my integrity. But no one had questioned it. The investigation had ended. Richard had served his sentence and disappeared. Catherine had moved on. I'll think about it, I said. Good. She walked to the door and paused with her hand on the frame. One more thing. What? Next time you have a secret, tell it while you still can. Don't leave it for someone else to find. I've thought about that conversation many times since. My daughter returned the key that day, told me she didn't need it anymore. I continued paying the fees on Unit 447 for another 6 months before I finally went back and emptied it. I kept the binder I'd prepared for my daughter. The rest I shredded, boxed, and disposed of properly. The storage unit sits empty now, but I haven't canceled the rental. I tell myself it's because breaking the contract requires paperwork I haven't gotten around to filing. But the truth is simpler. The empty space is a reminder that some things are worth keeping and others are worth releasing, and knowing the difference is the work of a lifetime. My daughter and I don't talk about that day often. When we do, she asks careful questions and I give careful answers. We've reached an understanding, the kind built on honesty that arrives late but still counts. She was right about the secret. I should have told it earlier, but she was also right about something else. The telling, when it finally came, didn't destroy anything. It just cleared space for what came next.